I set out to tell a week's worth of medical horror stories, but I didn't want to focus on the bloody or the grotesque, though there is plenty of that in prison medical or just prison in general. Rather, I wanted to touch on a couple of points regarding prison medical that I feel could be overlooked. First, I spoke about Jimmy, who claimed that he'd been tortured behind closed doors, and maybe I didn't make this clear, I really do believe he was telling the truth. But in the final analysis, it matters for very little, because the people who filled out the paperwork, the people who decide what really happened behind closed doors, those were also the people that Jimmy claimed was torturing him. That creates a situation which is intrinsically horrifying to me, that the people who are watching to make sure nothing wrong happens may also be the people doing the wrongdoing. I also spoke about my own medical problems in CDC, and they were nothing special. If anything, they were entirely mundane. I had an awful toothache, and they pulled the tooth. But because of the rules, the bureaucracy, just the reality of living in CDC, it was an awful experience for me. It was horrific. It hurt ungodly bad. And it just is what it is. That's what you expect whenever you go to prison. The last thing that I wanted to speak about was how unsure of an environment prison can be, and how somebody can just die and you didn't see it coming. I had a friend at SADF. His name was Adrian Torres. And I'm using his full name because I plan on advocating on his behalf at some point in the future if I can. Adrian was he was a good man, in my opinion. He wouldn't have liked being called that. He would have preferred that I call him a good Christian. And this is because he built his life around his relationship with God and Christ and his personal religious convictions. He had a job as a clerk back in the office with me, and if he wasn't doing that job, he was at the church, preaching, praying, perhaps even cleaning after the services ended. It didn't matter what he was doing. You could guarantee he was doing it in a manner that exemplified his personal convictions, and he was doing it all day, every day from what I saw. I was truly impressed. They moved me to another yard. I didn't see him for 2 months, and whenever I came back, the first thing I noticed was that Adrian had lost weight. It was impressive. He'd said he wanted to lose some, and I guess he managed it. Shook his hand, told him, "Man, you lost that weight. Congratulations." He gave kind of a sad chuckle, went, "Oh, yeah, you haven't been around for a couple of months, man. I almost died." And he didn't mean almost died as in he was pretty sick. He meant almost died as in the doctor in the ICU had a conversation with him about who he might want to call before they intubated him. Because if the antibiotics didn't kick in and start working, well, this was the end. As it turned out, Adrian did survive. He had contracted coccidioidomycosis, which I've spoken about before. It's more commonly called valley fever. It's a disease that's common in California's Central Valley, a fungal infection, which can be really bad in some people if they're particularly susceptible to it. Over the course of just a couple of weeks, Adrian went from noticing he had a little scratch in his throat to worrying that he wasn't going to be able to do the sermon that he had scheduled to do the next day, to being in the ICU and not knowing if he was going to survive. Of course, this is just the human condition, and prison is no different. Sometimes people get sick. Sometimes people die. And the thing that I wanted to draw attention to was that I thought Adrian was a good person, whatever the heck that might mean. And it was sad that he could die just over the course of a couple of months without having a chance to say goodbye to the people he loved, to tie up his loose ends. It got me thinking about how you qualify a good person. Adrian claimed that he was innocent of the crime that he was convicted of, but that has to be between him and his district attorney or jury. I couldn't possibly speak to who he was before he came to prison, or even before he came to the yard that I knew him on. And in some ways, that's true for everybody in prison. They're all running from something. It's like the Foreign Legion used to be. You can take it for granted that everybody there is at the end of a hard road. They've had wrong done to them and they've done wrong to others. And they probably don't want to talk about it. So the only way that you can make a decision as to somebody's character, whether they're a quote-unquote good person, is going to have to be how they act day to day. Adrian told me he acted one way, that he was a Christian, that he thought this way and acted this way. Well, at the end of a year of knowing him and interacting with him day in and day out, I can't speak to who he was before he came to prison, but the man I knew, yes, he was a good man, a decent man. And the idea that his life could just be snuffed out due to disease, accident, violence, and that he would never have a chance to go back out into the real world and demonstrate the changes that he'd made, that he was no longer the man that went to prison, that he was a better man for the time he served. That is just as horrific of a fact as I can think about. And it's what intrinsically makes prisons the worst place to be. It's because regardless of the degree to which you rehabilitate yourself or change, you're still there. And in many cases, you're still going to die there. A murderer who can't rewrite that final chapter of his story. And perhaps rightly so, because you can't take back the awful things you did either. In your everyday life, if you have the opportunity to let somebody be who they say they are, the way they're acting right then, instead of who they are in the past, just the bad things they did. And this may seem a little bit suspicious coming from a convicted felon. Try to give the guy the second chance. Try and let him be a better person, starting right then, if you can. Because sometimes that's all we really need, is a second chance. Thank you for listening today.